So today we're going to get into using the Symmetry Tool in Photoshop to create out a mask. I've already placed in the image that I'm going to be basing my design on. You can see over in layer 1. If I do want to place in the image, I can go up to File and Place Embedded to place in the PNG. Once I do have the image placed, I'm going to create out a new layer, and for right now I'm just going to rename this Outlines. With the outline layer, I'm going to go over to my brush tool, left side navigation. You could use the brush tool or the pencil tool for this symmetry. But with the brush tool selected, we're going to take a look at the top navigation where I can see this butterfly icon, set symmetry options for painting. I'm going to click on the set symmetry to painting and choose the vertical. With the vertical, Photoshop is automatically going to place a line directly in the middle of our document, and I'm going to drag this to the top edge and to the bottom edge just so I can see the guideline as I'm tracing. Once I have the line set, I can click Done and make sure that you have the outline layer selected as we're about to trace. If you don't want to work with black outlines, I would recommend change your foreground color to whatever color outlines you want to work with. I'm going to keep mine black for today. But understand that we want to get into adjusting the size of the brush. I can adjust my brush very small. When it gets into tracing out lines, we can go freehand, clicking and dragging, trying to replicate the line that we see. But because of this line that's directly down the middle, I only want to focus on the left side, and it will replicate everything over onto the right side of that dividing line. So if I'm going down to the chin area, if I were to click and drag, we can see that it connects that same line. I could match the little cutout or piece broken off on the chin area, but understand that this is going to replicate to the other side. So if I want to match it, you'll see that it will create that cut on the bottom right side as well. Again, freehand does take some getting used to. If you're not comfortable with the mouse, I would recommend taking your time or get into understanding that you are likely going to have to hit Command or Control Z to undo and redraw a line several times until you get it right. The other method is looking to trace out lines clicking point by point. Clicking point by point allows me to be able to connect from point A to point B. Each time I click, it will automatically make a connection between those lines. So if I were to continue to hold down Shift, it would make a connection from every point that I make in between. So if I wanted to go around the outside edge of this square or diamond shapes that I'm seeing, I can click point by point and look to match those lines as best possible. So again, if I wanted to shrink down the size of my brush, I could make thinner lines connecting in between. But what I do want to make sure is that I'm connecting all the way to the edges of other lines. You don't want to leave lines in between or gaps in between, or else the colors are going to automatically fill in for any open sections. But again, I'm just going to take my time to connect in between these lines. They may not match exactly, but I'm just looking to match it with efficiency for this demonstration. So again, for any straight lines, I can click point by point. If I start to get into curves, I can shrink those curved points downward so it's a little bit more accurate and still looks like I have a curved line even though it is a little bit jagged. Matching any lines that I want to, I click point by point to kind of replicate what I see from the mask that I have here. If again I do want to thicken up the lines, just adjust with the right bracket or left bracket with your keyboard keys, and I can look to replicate the line out as I want. One difficulty is not getting these sharp edges. If you do want to go with a sharp edge, you would have to shrink down your brush very tiny and then look to fill in those gaps in between two lines, as we'll see a little bit later on. I'm just going to look to try getting these sharp edges. And you can see I'm just going to connect back up to where I originally saw. If I mess up at any point, I can always hit Control Z Just step back. I will have to reconnect to where I started with the point. But again, it's just understanding that it will replicate to the right side as I'm just trolling out the left. But again, you're not required to use a thin brush throughout. Practice whatever feels comfortable to you. I'm going to connect there. And again, I can always scale up the size of my brush to get larger lines or focus on bigger lines as I want. So you can see it's a lot easier to get these a little bit more accurate to the sample that we're basing off of if I'm holding down Shift for these line drawings. And it doesn't matter if you're going on the left side or right side, whatever you're comfortable with, you can reduce down. If I don't like the jagginess of the lips, I can always just step back, Command or Control Z. And again, I'm just going to look to undo so I can go a little bit bigger brush and get more comfortable with drawing out freehand. If you want to adjust at the top navigation, you can modify your smoothness. I wouldn't recommend anything above 40%. It can slow down your computer, especially if you have a lower graphics card or processor. It may not recognize it or be able to provide you the highest quality, or it may stall or crash your program. So just understand, be patient with it. It does take some getting used to draw out freehand, but you can still get very accurate lines if you take your time. But it's going to take my time as I trace out some of these lines. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's good practice to get comfortable with the tools. If I do want to redo some lines, I can always go back, Control Z. And unfortunately, the pen tool does not work for the reflected areas. If I were to switch over to the pen tool, that line in the middle gets eliminated and it won't trace over. So understand that you can draw with the pen tool, but unfortunately it does not do the reflection for these images. You can look to copy pieces over. If I decided that I wanted to make a shape, make an object, or make an ear, say, I can take the current layer that I just created, make a copy of it, duplicate layer, and then I can look to click and drag this over to the other side and reflect it. So I can create another variation of it. Just understand it's not going to be using the reflection tool of the brush tool. But again, I'm just going to trace out these lines. It's good practice. Understand you can also change the thickness. If I reduce down the size of my brush, I have to redefine a new line. So if I want to get a sharper line, I can always go back over top of an area. But that way I can get some different weights on my strokes as well. So you can see I'm doing the right side of the face as well, and it will reflect over on the left side. So whichever side you're more comfortable with, you can trace over. Again, make sure that you're getting as accurate. If I want to get a curved line or create a curved shape for a line, I would want to click small points take my time to go around the outside edge of what I'm trying to trace. Or just be more creative and create out your own mask. Just taking your time to replicate or create out an intricate design. Make sure that if you do want to start a fresh new line, you don't hold shift from the last line you made. You can hear how many little clicks I have to make to try creating out a curve shape, but trying to get the mask replicated as best possible. With these big thick chunks of black that I see on the left and right side, again, I'll probably just go with an outline, and then I can fill them in with whatever color I want later on. Then we'll just get the details at the top. And the big thing is making sure that you always connect those black lines. You don't want to leave any lines open, or it will fill out gaps with the same color that you may not necessarily want. Or you can adjust the size of the brush, make the lines thicker. Once they do cross over on this intermediate line, understand that they will technically make a connection and one shape when you get into filling these lines in later on. We'll see that in momentarily. I'm not trying to get every detail, but just good practice to see what you can create, what you can kind of draw out using this method. So again, if I want to go more free form, I can just look to trace out the lines. But now that I have every line traced out, I can get into thinking about coloring. The important step before you do color, I would recommend duplicate out your outlines layer. I'm going to right click on the layer, duplicate out, and I'm going to rename the original layer color, and keep my outlines on the top. Always have an additional copy that has not been adjusted with any colors. That way we can fill in some areas later on or add in highlights or shadows. So when I want to get into coloring this, I go over to my paint bucket tool. I can either pick out colors from the color panel on the top or go into my swatches. It's up to you to figure out what color type of colors that you want. So if I want to stay with a light or a pure, it's up to you to figure out what color combinations you want to use. So if I want to start filling in, I have a green color currently as my foreground color, and I have the paint bucket tool selected. Understand the paint bucket tool will fill in any area you click in, but make sure that you are on the paint bucket tool left side navigation here. We'll take a look at the gradient tool momentarily as well. But with the paint bucket tool, because I have every line enclosed, it's automatically going to fill in the area that I want on my mask. If you do leave an opening, or if you do leave a gap in between a certain area, it will fill in the entire space. So if I ended up clicking on the background, it would automatically fill the entire background very quickly. But if I want to consider playing with different variations, I can click point by point. Any area that I want to fill, you see that it automatically places into those colors. But you can see that I currently have the color layer selected, and I have left my outline layer on top. We'll talk about that shortly as we get into any type of shadows or effects. So other color combinations, you see I can put in the yellow, or try very expressive colors. See what you can create. You can see that I do have these gaps. If I decided that I wanted to have these filled in with black, just a matter of choosing out the brush to fill in those sections. Same thing if I want on the cheeks, or if I don't like black, if I don't want it that overwhelming, I can just always step back, try a different color combination, and we see how it's going to fill in those sections. It's just, again, all about experimentation, seeing what you like, what works. You can always reset a color just clicking inside the area. Understand that this is currently transparent on the inside, so if I do want to fill it in with white, make sure to click inside those areas with white. So once you get the hang of it, it's just a matter of clicking inside the areas, and you can fill these spots with whatever color combination you like. If I do want to go with gradients, I could always use the magic wand tool. If I go over to the gradient tool and I try to click inside an area, you see that it does automatically fill in the entire space. If I want to fill in the teeth area, I would probably recommend using the magic wand tool to select on the area that you want to modify. Then click on the gradient tool, and I can click and drag. Because I have that selected area, it only affects that area of my drawing. So you can see how it's going to affect the design. Again, just use the magic wand tool. If I want to click inside these little gaps where the gray is here, just select those areas out. Command Z if I mess up on the selection. But once I have those areas selected, again, click on the gradient tool. I can pick out a different color combination or just look to draw out a different color, and we see how it fills in those areas. Same thing with these cheeks, off these lines. If I want to choose out a different gradient, I can pick out from customized variations. Do more of a yellow, green. Or I can experiment with a radial gradient, see how that color is going to carry out. Want to fill in the eyes, want to fill in the nose and mouth. Again, it's just a matter of holding down Shift and click on the points I want to fill. And just keep it easy for this demonstration. Let's go over to my black, and either I can click with the paint bucket one at a time, or I can go up to Edit Fill because I have that selected area. I'm going to fill that in with black, and you see that automatically fills in those spaces. So once I have this mask selected, what I'm actually going to do is duplicate out my outlines one more time. This just adds a lot more detail if I get into, I'm going to rename this outlines layer, highlights and shadows. Because I have the highlights above my color layer, I can add in highlights or shadows sitting above the color itself. I still have my outlines on top, but if I go back over to my brush tool, as you can see that line back now placed. I can sample colors if I wanted to work off one color. I'm going to look to see what happens when I get a darker version. So I have a shade, and I'm going to click on my brush tool. With my brush tool, I can click and drag and create out what is a shade over top of a certain section. Again, make sure that you have your highlights and shadows layer selected. And you can see it's actually going behind these black lines because it's sitting behind on the highlights layer. So if I wanted a shade underneath the nose, or on the nostril area, if I wanted to get a darker purple, again, I can use the eyedropper tool, match out the purple over here. Now with the shade of purple, I can fill in the nostril area. So it creates a little bit more three-dimensionality on these pieces. So if I wanted to match out this yellow, maybe I want to do a highlight or a lighter area, I can use the paintbrush, go with a bigger brush, but I'm doing it towards the top edge of this area, and it kind of creates a little highlight at the top edge of that, or if I want to follow along with the cheek. We're seeing that we can create a little bit more interest, so it's not just a flat mask. We're creating dimension to it. So if I wanted a darker yellow or a shade, I can click and drag down the area that I want to paint in. Again, just making sure that I stay inside of the black lines. Just creating out a little shade underneath of certain areas of the face. So maybe underneath the lip or underneath the nose, creates a shadow effect. If you want to give different highlights to different areas, again, you can use the eyedropper tool to match out a color I want to work with. I'll pick out a highlight section. If I accidentally go into some black areas, I can always undo. Just step back and then fill in the areas as I want. So if I want darker or shades of it, I can darken up my blue. Click and drag, and we can see that's applying on both sides of this shape. If I ever wanted to do just one side, I could uncheck and undo my vertical symmetry. But often not, you do want to have that reflected sides. So if I want to match out a color, just use the eyedropper tool. You can sample out different shade or highlight or tint. You can see just adding in dimension so it's not so flat. If you ever just wanted to do highlights of white, you could always use the paintbrush with white. add some key elements that might just make some areas pop. Or if I want to just reduce down the size and brush, I can make little white highlights. Just take your time and see what you can create. Again, you can always use that combination. If I want a straight line, I click a point, hold down Shift, click a point, I get that straight line that I'm looking for. You can just see how much better the design is once you have a number of colors into your work. But experiment, have fun, and see what you can create. I hope you enjoyed.